Hi, I'm Sarah Mace. I was the CWC coordinator for OCHA in the Philippines for 8 months. Is this on? Yes. And then surged and deployed to be the next L3 CWC coordinator in Iraq taking some of the lessons learned. So it's kind of quite interesting to hear what you've all been saying, obviously having been kind of quite part of it. And I agree with like a lot of what you've been saying. This split between AAP and CWC had disintegrated by the end of the response. And I think that isn't something that we should be focusing on. And it just views CWC more as a tool to make AAP happen, and the two are very much dependent on each other. Interestingly, you're talking about some of the lessons learned and how we can do that. And I just wanted to highlight an initiative that's happening in Iraq at the moment. It is a completely different environment. It's incredibly a lot more complicated, I would suggest, than in the Philippines. Conflict, lots of different population groups, large amount of distrust among the population between hosts, government, various different agencies, UN, local population, everyone. So to try and address some of this, there's a response-wide mandated accountability tool being put in place. Now, this is being led from the HC through the Humanitarian country team, and is funded by UNHCR, WFP, OCHA, UNFPA, World Vision, and NRC. And it's been mandated at that level that all the clusters should be involved in it. And it's going to be a call center set up, currently recruiting 4 to 6 staff who will sit in a room and will be directly responsible through a coordinator to the HCT and individual clusters to be providing two-way information. So people can ring up with issues, and people can also ring up to find out, I'm an IDP, how do I get my child into school? Which schools are teaching in Arabic? Or I'm an IDP, I can't get my child into school, why is this not possible? And then the information can be then fed back to the education cluster. So I think this is taking some of the lessons, I forgot IOM in that lot, sorry. This is taking some of the lessons learned from Typhoon Haiyan, especially looking at the kind of system-wide structures and the joint feedback and joint coordination in a much more complicated environment. So I think if we're talking about this in 1 year's time, it'll be very interesting to see how this project goes forward and what we've done, what we can take from the Philippines, which is the good bit, and try and leave all the bad bit. We'll see what happens.
Thanks very much. Just to let you know that HPN is going to be publishing an issue of the Exchange on the situation in Iraq, the crisis in Iraq, in probably September. So it would be interesting if you and your colleagues want to write an article to contribute to that on that experience. Please think about that. Okay, thank you very much. Yes, over here.
Thanks. Mark Galloway from the International Broadcasting Trust. I want to pick up Nikki's point about communication and also follow up what you said, Alex. You said we need a change of mindset from delivering aid to working with local people involved in reconstruction. Do we also need a change of mindset in terms of communication? I mean, how effective do you think NGOs really are at communicating? Are we also used to delivering words, messages, information, rather than using communication for a genuine dialogue? And should we maybe skill up our communication skills and our ways of using local and international media?
It's a very good question. I've got an online question here, which I wanted to pose, and we'll take one more from the audience before coming back to our panel. This is from Kelly Harilishan, which I always mispronounce her name, who is from Plan UK. And Kelly's asking, what role do donors, ECHO, OFDA, DEC, have to push for greater integration of AAP in all humanitarian responses rather than isolated projects on AAP? So looking at the integration, holistic integration of AAP as opposed to a projectized approach. And then I think was there anybody on this side of the room? Not yet? We have someone here.
Hi, I'm Carla Benham from World Vision. Alex, you made an important point at the start around not just focusing on the methods of engaging with communities, but also what's happening in response to their voice. And I'm wondering if we're also collecting evidence around that in terms of what changes we've been seeing at agency level as well as at a collective level in response to the trends or individual cases that are coming through.
Okay, thank you. Let's start with those. And some of those were directed to you, Alex, but we'll also ask others to comment. So why don't you start off?
Okay, let me just give a very brief comment on those. So wonderful to hear what's happening in Iraq. Please write that article. It's a must. We've got to collect this experience somehow, and great that those lessons you're taking them on and the colleagues are taking them on. In terms of how good are NGOs at communications, I think that's a really good challenge. And I think it's kind of interesting that one of the things that's emerged with CDAC's development in recent years is the new focus on media communications. And I hope that that reflects a more respectful sense by international NGOs of the context that we work in, and that actually media already exists and people deserve to be informed in a respectful and appropriate way and communicated with. I know some colleagues we're working with in IOM think that NGOs are just in the Stone Age when it comes to this, and I think in some areas they're right. Part of what I was mentioning around using collective approaches, I think links very much to what Nikki said about working with the grain, with existing media where possible. So this work with Radio Bante, it's fantastic. I was talking with IOM, with colleagues from IOM in Tacloban just over a month ago, and they were saying, well, you want to reach people, let's do TV ads. That's what people are going to watch. Now we're moving through, TV's getting back up and running there. If you really want mass communications, be serious about it. And I was thinking, well, we don't do that. We're an NGO, but maybe we should. So I think we have a lot to learn, and I think we're moving that way. Kelly's point on the role of donors on an integrated approach, donors clearly have a crucial role to play, no question, in shaping the sorts of incentives that typically influence field operations. I think the CHS is a really important opportunity for that integrated approach. And I think some of the lessons coming out of Haiyan that we already mentioned around the role of donors, investing in positions like an OCHA AAP coordinator, that's really crucial. Funding field positions for community liaison, however we call it, that's really crucial. It's not just going to happen. I think one of the things that we've learned again is that if you just try to add it on to the M&E team's responsibilities, it just doesn't happen. And I think one of the interesting aspects of this looking forwards is, well, what is the agenda for donors, and how do we work with donors to develop an agenda which we feel will create the incentives for good practice more consistently based on common tools, and also create the kind of accountability upwards that's necessary. What changes are seen in response to what people are saying? A colleague from World Vision, it's such a great point, and it's something that we wrestle with. We talk about closing the feedback loop. I think we're getting better at dealing with that on an individual basis. So when people are texting in, if people raise specific concerns, we've got much more systematic at logging those and then providing responses. But that's, of course, only a part of the answer. To what extent are we changing our work, which is really a big deal here? I think that also goes back to the previous question with the role of donors. One of the things that donors could do would be require replanning for a major humanitarian response after 3 months. Of course, the initial plans were developed quickly in a chaotic situation with imperfect information. Of course they were. It would be ludicrous to say, well, this is now a blueprint you've got to follow for the next year. And yet somehow we find ourselves in those positions at times. So I think to enable that response, we could think about what scope is there to make that much more standard. I would say also within agencies like Plan and others, as well as with donors, an expected replanning. Though recognising the costs associated with that. We all know how much time and effort it takes to develop a log frame. Just one other last point on that. I think one of the interesting things going on in the Ebola response at the moment is the work Ground Truth is doing, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, doing public opinion surveys of one sort or another about perceptions of the response with very pointed questions. Really interesting data. And there's still a big question, who's going to use it to take what decisions? And that brings back to this point about, well, if you have AAP representation at the most senior levels of decision makers, for instance, in the cluster system, then you've got a way of closing that loop, which is what the Common Feedback Forum did in the Philippines. Again, I would point you towards the CDAC case study on that.
Thanks, Alex. So I think what you're saying is we really need to be able to take an iterative approach to the work that we're doing. And perhaps it's more of an ongoing responding to what's happening, being able to change, having that flexibility rather than a formal one-off replanning exercise. So that's something to think about as well, how that would actually work. And it may be different in different contexts. I wonder if we've really answered Mark's question about communications as an information exchange tool versus a way of building dialogue with affected communities. And I wonder, Nikki, if you could speak to that point.
Sure, I think, just rereading the question. So I think that in terms of how effective, the question was kind of around how effective NGOs really are in communicating with communities. And I think, to talk about the CDAC network, that's kind of why it exists, really, to bridge that gap between NGOs and media agencies and to kind of develop a cadre of communications professionals that can really support in this instance. The CDAC network's developing a roster at the moment of communications professionals who should be able to be deployed to different responses to kind of support with that improvement in communication. But I think it goes broader than that as well in terms of within individual agencies, really skilling up people that can talk to local media and
something separate that you hire professionals to do when you do the real work. It has to be more integrated.
It has to be integrated and it has to be something that people feel confident to be able to do. And I think partly in the Philippines, but in other responses as well, we've seen this kind of there not being anybody that speaks the local language that is sort of empowered by their head office of an agency to actually go and talk to the local media and explain what NGOs projects are and to really engage in that dialogue. And so I think that it needs to be broader, and we need to kind of focus on skilling up the very, very frontline workers in communicating and be able to provide information, just being able to talk to communities and provide the information that people are asking for, and to be able to take feedback and comments back to agencies as well.
Thanks, Nikki. Mike?
Very little I can add to the sort of well-informed comments of my two colleagues here. I think one of the interesting things for us at ActionAid in terms of our response is that we worked with one partner who we discovered a few weeks into our response actually was doing radio programming before we'd even started working with them. And therefore, suddenly finding there was a capacity that we didn't have, that we didn't know we had, and the difference that made, not just in their area, but in terms of the sort of the overall coming together of communications with the affected communities in our response, made a big difference. One of the things I think we picked up in the Missed Opportunities report was that the researchers found a very interesting use of language. But when they were talking about how sort of INGOs were relating to communities, the communities described it as bringing help. When they talked about how local organisations were relating to them, they talked about working with us. And that was a really sort of powerful illustration of the sort of, the integration and the communications and the accountability within that. I think one last point really from me, which is the example from Iraq, which I'd agree with others, is fascinating and would really like to know more. But just sort of my immediate concern was, is that going to be another way of excluding local organisations? From in Iraq, obviously the context is very different. So there may not be that, but how does something as good and effective as that not become a barrier to access for local organisations?
Yeah, and I'm equally as in fear that there'll be yet again we missed in the HPN report in Iraq.
Thanks very much. Olaf, are you still with us?
Oh, yes, I am.
I wondered if you wanted to make any comments. I mean, maybe perhaps from the government's perspective, do you think there's any scope for, do you think the government is doing these things well, and is there any scope for some of the local government people or the government to either share their learning or learn from the experience that the international community has had around AAP and communications?
Well, I mean, the big discussion that is going on right now in the Philippines is where did all the money of the government go, or where will it go? In other words, the accountability of the money that is under public funds is quite questionable. And right now, I think the international community could also move towards and encourage the government to be more transparent about the way they are spending their money or the way they are allocating money, and about then in the end about how it has been spent, reporting. Where I see still big gaps. I mean, there are a lot of reports from the government on how they spend, but they are kind of not systematic. So a little bit of here, a little bit of there, and it does not fit together. I think the public here in the Philippines, or the communities, if you want to put it like that, is really expecting that they see where did this go. There's a big suspicion that a lot of money was embezzled, went into corruption, and so on. It's not, finally proven, but there's at least a suspicion there because the accounting of the government is quite poor right now.
For that, those are important points that also are related in terms of accountability. I've got two more online questions, but I saw several hands in the audience. Wow. So I'm going to start with those. Let's see. I think this lady here first, and then over here on the other side of the room.
Hi, Amanda Barnes, Relief International. Alex, I just wanted to pick up on something you said about replanning, and I wanted to know if the panel had any thoughts about what kind of tools could be used for involving the community and local NGOs in that process.
Thank you. Over here.
Thank you, Vicky Murta, Christian Aid. And actually, I might be able to answer some of that question myself. So one of the questions that's raised very frequently with our partners when we're doing trainings, and we do a lot of trainings with partners, is about the flexibility for replanning and whether or not our funding bodies would actually allow for this, because they're very committed to participatory planning with local communities. I had a specific conversation with Annie Davenport at DEC not so long ago, and I hope I'm not misquoting her, but she said to me that basically she and DEC consider it fundamental that we do consider replanning if necessary, if this is a result of the assessments and participatory planning processes, because they see there's no point in actually continuing along a path that's of no use to people. So I think that's kind of summarised her response on that. And obviously we do have a situation where DFID and ECHO as well are very committed to accountability. So I believe that they do have a fundamental belief in assessing and making sure that you change your programme according to the needs. Obviously this is very much dependent on the individual member of their staff who's actually in that country and their way of working. But also relating to the coordination, recently in the last couple of years we've had quite a lot of funding through from ECHO in India and Bangladesh, and they've actually actively encouraged consortiums between INGOs and local partners. So they are trying desperately to encourage good coordination, because if you have a consortium, of course you have to work together on your funding proposals, and that means that you're reducing your gaps and overlaps. So I think that probably answers some of that. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks very much. Yes, I think on the replanning question, I mean, I wasn't arguing against it. I was trying to point out that if you're building in that iterative approach from the beginning, then by definition you should be able to do that as you go along, rather than having a defined point in time at which you do replanning. So I think it's good to hear that that's the approach that's being taken. Let's take a couple more. Over here we've got two more, Tanya. And then we'll take our online questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, morning. I'm Stijn Albus. I work for Internews, and we set up Radio Baghdad in Giwan, Eastern Samar. I've worked in South Sudan as a CWC technical advisor after that, and I'm now Ebola coordinator, again trying to establish CWC in the Ebola response. I wanted to reply to the question or the around, like, are we doing good communication and should we get better at communication? And actually, like, for a moment, I'm actually bouncing back because my spontaneous response would be no. Like, please don't get better at communication, because what I'm fearing is that will include a very heavy process of more professionals coming in with more crafts and ideas and creativity that actually is a very heavy and very coordinated, but mostly very controlled process. And I think that's something we need to think about as a humanitarian system, is like we are desperate for controlling the message, and that's resulting in a very closed communication. Whereas where I think if you set up channels which allows people to talk, to ask questions, and address any question that is there, and take it serious, as in like answer those, like that's brilliant communication in itself. And if they don't get it, there should be like maybe some kind of coaching that allows people to actually ask, like, I didn't get it. Like, what did you mean by that? Like, just that very simple mechanism is probably brilliant communication in itself, rather than crafting a better message and having a process which involves like focus group discussions and the whole lot to actually get it more accurate, more localized, more of everything, but slows it down and makes it a very closed and controlled process, which makes people feel excluded. So I think, I mean, of course, better communication is, of course, a goal, but maybe it's also about an approach, and it's about being approachable as an organization and as a system as a whole.
Very, very interesting point. Thank you. Just at the back there.
Morning. I'm Chris Ford. I'm with World Vision. I was in the Philippines during Typhoon Haiyan as a program coordinator with Child Fund. I just wanted to pick up on something I think all the panel has alluded to, which is the issue of capacity within NGOs during the initial sort of couple of weeks after a disaster of this kind. And in my own experience, you know, we had donors coming at us across from all over the world asking for proposals, you know, with a turnaround of a week, maybe, you know, asking for X, Y, Z to, you know, maybe a focus on shelter or a focus on food or water, which we obviously have to respond to. And the sort of the cluster system kicks in quite shortly after that. And we're all talking about the who, where, what, and not so much the how in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. And of course, by the time we do start talking about the how, in many ways, I think the horse has bolted because we've already submitted our proposals. So what I'm kind of wondering is where does the role of preparedness come into all this, both in terms of donors, in terms of making sure we have flexibility in the kind of proposals we submit and then the programs we have to implement, but also in terms of NGOs, in terms of preparing ourselves to respond to disasters in a coordinated fashion. And a quick example, if I may, we are working in child protection specifically, and a lot of agencies were doing child-friendly spaces, and something as minor as trying to harmonise the stipends that we paid for local volunteers to deliver these child-friendly spaces was something that we took months to try and coordinate amongst, you know, major agencies, which I think kind of highlights how difficult it can be for us to coordinate on even some of the smallest issues, and how important it is to be prepared before the disaster strikes to respond in a coordinated fashion instead of agencies in isolation. And if I may, I just also had a second point about local NGOs. Having sat on many of the cluster meetings during the response, the visibility of local agencies and clusters was very, very minor, maybe with the exception of the Philippine Red Cross. And I wonder what the panel thinks about the role of UN OCHA and also INGOs in facilitating that participation of local NGOs in the cluster system. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I've got two questions online, but I think they're both from Plan, in fact. So I think, and we won't let Alex answer those. We'll make somebody else answer them.
You asked us to promote the event. We promoted the event.
But let's start with the ones we have in the room, and then we'll move to our online questions. Who would like to go first? Mike, maybe this time?
Yeah, shall I go first and start at the end there? On the role of local NGOs, yes, I mean the whole of the Missed Again and Missed Opportunities reports and what we have in this latest issue sort of pick up on that and the culture. I mean, I think there's a balance between what certainly many of the agencies involved in the Missed Again report, people like Oxfam, people like ActionAid, CAFOD, and our colleagues from Christian Aid and Tier Fund, in terms of, facilitating your local partners to be engaged. At which point, one of our partners asked me, "Do I say I'm from ActionAid or do I say I'm from my organisation? Are you sending me or am I going in my own right?" Because I think if you say you're sending me, I might be listened to more than if I go in my own right. But at the same time, I'm not really part of you, am I? And so I think, what does facilitating mean in a way that doesn't become instrumentalising is important for us. I suppose, should we be facilitating? Facilitating implies that people aren't there of their own right, and I think yes, some of what we should be doing is facilitating, but it's also giving people the independence to be there, and there is something about the culture of those responses that needs to be tackled on that, and yes, I mean, again, preparedness and an obligation for that comes up very strongly in the Missed Again report. I suppose we do also have to ask the question, what are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to coordinate for? If it's taken us so long to harmonise stipend for child-friendly spaces, is that really the best use of our time? Are there other things we should be worrying about more than in this part of the Philippines? They're paid a little bit more than that part of the Philippines. We're in a country, we're in a city where 10 different bus companies pay the bus drivers on the same routes 10 different salaries and stuff. What are we trying to achieve by our coordination is perhaps more important than which bits do we coordinate. On the replanning stuff, and flexibility, yes, it's vitally important, and yes, Vicky, you're right about certainly the DEC's approach. I don't know if I've ever submitted sort of a report that sort of complies to the plan we'd submitted 3 months earlier in those early stages. Flexibility is important. The danger, of course, with that is, let's stick in the standard application that we know is the donors always like, and then we'll do what we want to anyway and tell them, we had to replan. So you've got to get a balance in terms of sort of knowing what you're trying to achieve. But, I think, certainly people say they're open to flexibility. Sometimes the challenge is putting them, their reality up to the rhetoric.
Thanks for that. Nikki?
Sure. I obviously really welcome Stein's point. It's perhaps not about putting a lot of communications professionals in and trying to get better in that sense, but actually developing a culture of approachability, I think, is really key. And it talks back to Alex's point before about keeping it simple, not trying to complicate something which should actually be very intuitive and very natural way of behaving in a humanitarian response. In terms of the barriers to local NGOs, I can just talk for what came through in our review, which was, again, that question of capacity. So despite local NGOs being closest to communities, being the most obviously accountable because they were just down the road and people could knock on their door if they had any questions, and being in constant communication and dialogue with communities, local organisations didn't really have the staff or the capacity to be able to attend working groups, despite the best efforts of the working groups to really try to reach out through email and try to kind of keep information being shared. It wasn't always easy for them to be as involved, and I think there's obviously cultural barriers as well to that. In terms of preparedness, just to talk to Chris's point there, I think to what extent can we prepare in a context where we don't know that the disaster is going to happen, or I don't know, but in terms of seeing how this has played out in Typhoon Ruby, the importance of that relationship and the trust that's been built, and also having precedent. So even before Typhoon Haiyan, actually, many of the national staff who I met again after Typhoon Haiyan, I'd met previously after Typhoon Bopha, staff working for agencies like IOM who are really far ahead with CWC. They were bringing best practice from previous responses. They already had ideas about how to do this well, albeit being a different region of the Philippines. They were bringing those best practices, but also those relationships which had been built previously. And I think but we've seen that again in Typhoon Ruby, perhaps even stronger because it's been in a similar area. And so I think there's still many lessons to be learned from how this kind of preparedness as a result of previous disasters happened, and how we can replicate that in other situations. We need to figure that out.
Maybe we'll learn something from the Iraq example as well. Before I go to Alex, I'm just going to ask Olaf if you would like to comment on any of those questions. You're not obliged to, but is there anything you'd like to add?
I mean, I'm looking more at the role of the government and not that much to the NGOs. But NGOs certainly also have a role in preparedness in the sense of increasing risk awareness and what to do if a disaster strikes. So I'm not looking that much at the response side, but on this, say, long-term work, I see a lot of room for NGOs. So I would be happy if they would also work on these issues nowadays or in the future.
Thanks very much. Alex?
I just add 2 points. So I think it's a very interesting set of issues that have come up that I think are all very closely related. So the first point is that we just can't underestimate the impact of the practicalities of actually trying to do this work. It's incredibly difficult. And staff are working long hours, in very difficult situations, even in a relatively easy-to-operate environment like the Philippines. They go to Iraq, a whole other situation. So those practicalities, it has such implications that I think we're still trying to work through for our ability to coordinate and our ability to improve accountability. Just by example, we talk about, in theory, it's great to be able to replan, and of course, we all agree with that. It's very easy for people within agencies, and I've done this myself, to point the finger at donors and say, look, donors don't let us. But actually, we know that a planning exercise is a massive exercise that involves talking to a huge number of people on the ground, nothing to do with donors initially, and trying to get agreement about, well, what are we trying to do, and who's going to do what, and when, and how much it's going to cost, and how do we split up the money. It takes forever. It's a difficult job. And so as a tool for coordination on the ground, the planning process plays an important role as a tool for coordination on the ground. The idea of replanning after a few months is very easy to say, but of course there are real practical barriers to that. I know that conflicts with some of my previous comments, but I think we just have to recognise that that's the reality, and then work with the grain of that. And it closely links to my second point, which is our very limited ability to make and implement collective decisions. Now, we know that across the sector, as we've discussed previously just this morning, we're very fragmented as a set of agencies. We're very independent. We've got our own money and our own policies. We can't even agree on salaries and so on. So I think that also gives us pause for thought about what do we really try, just as Mike was saying, what do we really try to coordinate? And that's why I think the CHS, the core humanitarian standard, presents exciting opportunities. That a high-level framework that's framed in terms of what staff should be doing and what our recipients should be seeing on the ground, which is the first time we've had it framed in those ways, is very powerful. And if we could collectively come together and say, look, this isn't 100% perfect for us in every situation, but it's pretty good in most places, that would take us a very long way forwards. And to be honest, we will never get higher than that standard. This is pretty good in most places. That's a very, very high standard to reach for some sort of central management tool like the CHS. So if we could agree to come around with that and say, look, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good and we can work with it and we'll try to improve it, then I think we could try to get coordination at a much higher level, or at least more effective collaboration I would talk about, because coordination, of course, brings its own risks. Let me leave it at that.
Thanks very much. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I have a couple of questions online questions. Any others from in the room? Any other comments or questions? Okay, let's take these two, and then I'll read out the ones from our plan colleagues. And then we'll have a very quick response so we can finish on time.
My name is Vivian Brook. I was working with Internews. We emailed.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
And then with IOM in the Haiyan response, also on communication. And I was just wondering, and that's specifically, I think, for Alex and for Mike, the question, like, how do you work on the sustainability of this accountability with local communities and also communication? Because, I do think, especially with these collective responses, on the one hand, that's very good to coordinate and get it together, but then what Mark raised earlier, the sort of problematic of how can we still establish a dialogue, and that I think gets even more difficult when we look at the long-term impact and at the sort of what is left after we leave.
Maybe related to Barb's point about the culture of accountability, so that it becomes the way we do things around here rather than just a project that we have funded. Yes, we have someone else over here.
Hi, I'm Sophie from Rescue Global, and my question's sort of related, I guess. I was just wondering what you would say the major lessons learned in terms of how the response phase actions can either positively or negatively impact upon the recovery and development phase.
Thank you. And then I'll just read out the questions from our colleagues at Plan. I think it's Craig Dean asked, what lessons have we learnt from engaging children and young people in AAP mechanisms? So I don't know if anyone on the panel can speak to that. And then Anita Williams at Plan noted that it is concerning that the language used by government and NGOs can be confusing to local communities, such as storm surge, as Olaf was talking to us about earlier. So she's asking what lessons have been learned, if any, about preventing and responding to sexual exploitation and abuse of vulnerable groups. So for these two questions, I don't know if anyone can actually address those, but let's start with, should we start with Nikki? And again, you don't have to respond to all of the questions, and we'll try to be very brief.
Yeah, can I ask Alex, just because Viv's question was directed to Alex, I'm just interested in the sustainability question. Can I back that over to you, do you mind?
Just on that, good question. One of the things we're doing with Pamati Kita, as described in here, is trying to promote more of the government-led accountability mechanism. So it comes back to this same question, who's helping who? Are we trying to encourage other people to help us to do our work, or are we trying to really help local government and a whole lot of other actors to lead a local response? And if we see it that way around, then I think there comes a point when we have to stop running our own communications mechanisms and say, well, what we want to do is support existing communication accountability, which is what we're trying to do. And there are a range of interesting and hopefully impactful mechanisms. Yeah.
Thanks. Did you want to comment on any of the others while you have the floor?
Pretty big questions for the last minute.
Yes, I know. We can give you a couple.
To be honest, I don't have a lot to say. I don't have a lot of knowledge about the last two questions that Craig and Anita raised. I loved Olaf's phrase about we need to laymanize our language. I don't know if that's a tiny bit self-contradictory, because laymanize may not be the most straightforward, but I like the concept. The concept is great, and we need to do that. We need to keep these basic ideas simple. And so use simple language that works for everybody, and it's a pretty good test. If it works for children or adolescents, then we're probably speaking a language that most people can understand. Sophie, your question is vast, I'm afraid. The lessons on how recovery impacts on development, they're still emerging. I think some of the big evaluations that are being done will have a lot more to say about that than I'm able to say now.
And I think some of the other, we're focusing on accountability to affected populations in this event, but some of the other articles in the issue deal with that particular issue in more depth. Nikki, sorry, back to you.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to add, in terms of Craig's question about engaging children in accountability mechanisms, Save the Children have done a vast amount of work on that, and I think they have some really key resources available on their website, which is worth checking out.
Okay, that's good to know. Mike?
Yeah, on the sustainability point of accountability and communications, I think, Wendy, you sort of got the point very much there. It is around the issue of leadership. If the leadership is there, it then becomes part of culture, and it then becomes part of the commonplace practices, and that's when it becomes sustainable. If it's a toolbox, and even worse, if it's a toolbox you do because there's money related to it, as soon as those things stop, then those processes stop as well. They become just compliance tools and hurdles we have to jump over. Again, as Alex said, Sophie's question is vast, but I think one thing we have seen in the sort of period as we transition from response to recovery in the Philippines is that issues around trust, issues around sort of linkages into community and understanding communities are part of what makes the recovery planning more effective and avoids the multiple replanning.
Thanks very much. Olaf, I'm going to give you the last word. Any final comments you'd like to make in relation to those questions or otherwise? Olaf? Oh, I think we might have lost him. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Well, we've actually come to the end of our time, but I wanted to thank all of our panelists for generating a really interesting discussion, to all of you for the excellent questions and comments that you've contributed, both in the room and online. I hope you will read this issue of The Exchange, as well as the other reports that CDAC and the consortium that have produced Missed Again have brought. So thanks again to all of you, and I look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you.
Thank you.